Okay, hello. Welcome back to Sunday School Lessons. Happy Valentine's Day. That's when this should air. And as a complete act of rebellion, I've dressed Evie completely in gray for Valentine's Day. So we'll go with that. So we are doing the Sunday School lesson. We're actually going to be walking through the graveyard. I can't speak for everyone, but me personally, I've always found graveyards to be just remarkably relaxing places. They're just nice, quiet places to visit. So we'll walk around the graveyard for a while. So last week's lesson, as I mentioned before, it had to do with the temptations of Christ, and we very briefly talked about that in one of the classes. It wasn't the main. Like I said, we aren't doing the main lesson. It's alternate weeks to do the main lesson, but we did have the teacher did take a couple minutes to talk about what happened previously in the lesson, so I thought I'd, just talk a little bit about it. So if you remember from what I said about it, I basically classified the temptations of Christ into three groups. The three temptations into essentially three ways that the devil tempts us. Now, I always know, at least if you ever want to know, we'll phrase it that way, if you ever want to know if you're receiving inspiration from higher power, from God, or not, a good way to tell is if you say or do something really brilliant that you know you are not smart enough or brilliant enough to have done. And yeah, my comment about the ways the devil tempts us was very much one of those things. It came to me suddenly while I was actually doing the video. It wasn't a planned thing I had planned to say. And I related it. Come to discover, in the lesson, the teacher actually talked about something that was written by David O. McKay. He was the prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in the 1950s. And he had written essentially the exact same thing. He'd gone into further detail than I did. And I'll go into that just a little bit. So what he had said was that the first temptation, the temptation that was turning the stones into bread. Oh, getting too close to the edge there. Turning the stones into bread. That temptation of Christ, that was, one of the ways the devil tempts us, and it's to do with our appetites. Now, one of the interesting things I find is that, I have taught Sunday school lessons before and things like that, and one of the things, when you talk about appetites and stuff like that, almost immediately, everyone talks only about sexual appetites. They don't talk about other forms of appetite, like, hunger and eating. Certainly, it would be tempting if you had very little food, and then you were offered a great deal of food, all you had to do was kind of, say, bend your virtue a little bit. That would be a great temptation for you. And it's those sort of appetites, even appetites that are fairly natural, like eating, that can sometimes get us into trouble. So, so I just wanted to mention that. It's just kind of interesting that people always remember sexual appetites, but they tend to forget about, other natural appetites, just like regular hunger appetites and stuff like that. So the second temptation, David O. McKay classified as one of pride. And, it is. It's the devil starting out by saying, if you're really the Christ, and that, appeals to our pride. Okay, I'm taking a quick break from that and just saying that the one flaw in this game is that you can't pet the kitties. They're so cute. Anyway, back on topic. So yeah, it's it's pretty basic human nature that we as humans will almost always yeah, I'm going to turn around. I don't want to see kill criminals while giving a Sunday school lesson. But, you know, if challenged by something, we will respond to that challenge, you know, when otherwise we wouldn't have responded to it. So somebody said, you know, we're more likely to say things like, oh yeah, I bet I could do that, and go in that regard. Go in that way. So, yep, and the final temptation of Christ, which was basically the least subtle temptation, which was where he offered pretty much everything in the world if Christ would just worship the devil. That one is one that appeals to our greed and our avarice. And it's actually a very convincing one. It's, you know, I'm going to actually add a word that David O. McKay didn't add, which is entitlement as well. Because we feel not only that, you know, it'd be nice to have all this money and that, you know, we should have all this money, but that we deserve to have this money. We're entitled to all this money that, you know, we maybe didn't earn, that maybe isn't ours. So, make of that what you will. Let's see. Have I been this way? I don't think I've been this way. I'm going to try this way. So, yep, those were the three temptations, and that's what we discussed a little bit in the lesson. So let's move on to this next upcoming lesson, which is in the book of John. It's the chapters 2, 3, and 4. And they tell stories. So, yeah, just not to give away a spoiler here. Oh, why? That's a problem. It's not as peaceful as Parks. You still have missions that you should be doing. So I have to kind of go walk the other way because, you know, we're having a Sunday school lesson here, people. Sheesh. So, right. So there are three stories that are told. The first is of the when Christ attended the wedding, and it's the water to wine miracle. The second, and I'm going to leave the second story that's in John 3 for last. It's Nicademus coming to Christ. And finally, the final story is of Christ in Samaria, meaning the woman at the well. So we're going to start with the wedding. Oh. We're going to start with the wedding and talk a little bit about it. So there's actually an interesting point. I'm going to... I've got a good view here. I'll stand here. I'm going to read directly from the scriptures because this is another Joseph Smith translation moment. And the reason I refer back to these, I've done it in my last few talkings about the Sunday school thing, is because oftentimes in the King James Version, at least when I read it, it seems a little unclear, or I get a wrong impression. And then when I read the Joseph Smith version, it seems to make it much clearer. So this is chapter 2, verse 4. And Mary, mother of Jesus, had come to Jesus and said, you know, they have no wine. And so this is the King James Version, where it goes, Jesus saith unto her, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. Now, that sounds, you know, when I first read it, without reading Joseph Smith's translation, I always thought that's like he's saying no to her. But then in the next verse, his mother immediately goes to the servants and said, okay, whatever, you know, he wants you to do, you do it. So it seems like she you know, he was saying no to her and she ignored it and, you know, insisted that he do it anyway. So I've always found that a little bit confusing, but let's take a look at the Joseph Smith translation. So in Joseph Smith's translation, oh, for crying out loud. I'm sitting here trying to read things. Let's look this way. Right. Maybe the graveyard wasn't the best place to go. Anyway, Joseph Smith's translation, it says, Christ says, Woman, what wilt thou have me do for thee? That will I do, for mine hour is not yet come. Which completely changes the meaning of the verse, where he said, instead of saying, what do I have to do with thee, he's saying, what do you want me to do? he gives, actually a pretty good answer for a son responding to a mother, or any child responding to a mother. And that's what I find interesting about this story. John records it as Christ's first miracle. Yeah, let's get away from those messengers. And it's actually unique. At least, to my knowledge, that I can't think offhand of another miracle that was quite like this particular miracle. It was interesting because it doesn't... Most of his other miracles were, service to others, specific, serious events like injuries and deaths and healings of people who have been injured or hurt. Yeah, yep, I have been this way before. I recognize that cat. So we're going to walk over to Lambeth. But this one is unique in that it is a miracle that seems to be, saving a social thing. And the impression I get, this is just, gospel according to VG philosophy here, but the impression I get of it is that the reason that Christ did this miracle was solely because his mother asked him to. And I think that it actually presents a great example for pretty much all children. So, all children, how we respond to our mother. We don't necessarily... oh, sheesh. Sheesh, these guys are just... Yeah, I'm gonna do a little bit of running, get away from them, head over to Lambeth over here. We'll wander around Lambeth. Maybe it'll be more peaceful. So, so once again, Christ sets a great example for us in how we treat our parents. I think the entrance is this way. I'll go back this way. And it's really is an incredible example of how we should respond to our parents, even if it's not something we would normally do ourselves. If our parents ask us, "Hey, could you do this for me?" we would go up and say, "Yep, let's go ahead and do this." And it's just I think it's a great... I think there's a great lesson in there that we lose because of the King James translation of it. So, just once again, my own opinion on that. So, we're going to move on to the woman at the well in Samaria. And this is an interesting story. I'm not going to focus on the full details of it because it's pretty complex, and the rest of the chapter talks about something else as well. So, not going into full details on the rest of the chapter either. Just so Christ was traveling in Samaria, and he rested by a well while his apostles went out to find meat, I believe is what the scriptures say, but food to eat, basically. And he's waiting there, and he encounters a woman who's going to the well for water. And they start talking, and he mentions, he starts talking about, the water, and he mentions, he says, she asks, how can you draw water? And his response was that I can get you water that will make it so you never have to drink water again. You'll never be thirsty again. Now, I want to put this into a bit of perspective for the time period for things going on. They're living in a country. It's a very deserty country. It's, and they probably don't... her and her family don't have that much wealth, probably. I don't know for sure, but, she has to constantly go to the well and get water. It's a chore she has to do. And it's not just like, it's not like a chore at home like vacuuming where, you can leave it for a day or two. I mean, literally, they will die if they don't get water. So she has to be... It's a constant chore she has to be doing. And I can see the appeal. If somebody says, if I give you this water, you'll never have to drink again. I can see someone say, that sounds like a great idea. I never will have to drink ever again. I can just have water. I don't have to keep doing this chore. I don't have to... If there's, say, a drought, a famine, anything like that, I don't have to worry about it anymore. This is a great thing. So, I mean, the first her reaction is actually very typical, and it's a very good reaction. In that it's like, yeah, seeing it only the physical ideas of what he's saying, not the spiritual ones. And of course, Christ is talking about spiritual water. And I meant to look it up before I started this. I will. Yeah, I'll look it up later. But there is a scripture in the Old Testament that talks about there being a drought, not of water, but of the Spirit of the Lord amongst people, and what will happen to people during that drought. And we can actually kind of see it there when you don't take care of your spiritual needs. You experience this sort of drought. Your spirit just it doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to. Things don't quite go well. And I'm not talking about specifically only people who are atheists, but even people who are, say, who do believe in God and so on, but don't go to church. They don't read or especially don't study scriptures. They just kind of, believe in a very passive way and think that's all there is to it. And they're literally dying of thirst. Literally, okay, I'm not sure literally is the right word there. They're spiritually dying of thirst. It's not a literal dying of thirst, but their spirits are dying of thirst. And it affects them in ways that they would never know. You become much more susceptible, much more given to sinning. I'll use that phraseology. I think that sounds good. But yes, it affects your spirit, the way you act, the way you behave around people is greatly affected by how much spiritual stuff you take in. And if you cease to do spiritual stuff, you will die of dehydration spiritually. You'll spiritually dehydrate. Yeah, spiritual hydration. We'll call it that. Spiritual hydration, and it's not good, not healthy for you. So yeah, keep studying scriptures, keep going to church. That. Do what's good for your spirit. And yeah, leave it at that for that. And that's really all I want to talk about with the woman at the well. And we'll move on to Nicodemus. Now I saved Nicodemus for last because his story is he's one of my favorite stories in the New Testament. And it's not one of the bigger well-known stories. It's essentially Nicodemus visiting Christ in the middle of the night. Now, something I discovered from the lesson, it's one of those things where, you would, I wonder if I can go into Lambeth or not at this point. Nope. Oh, well. So, it's one of those things where it seems like I should have known it before, but I'm not entirely sure offhand if I actually did know it before. I may have learned it a long time ago and just forgotten, but after his visit to Christ, Nicodemus actually, didn't just visit Christ in secret after that. He was very, very supportive in public of Christ and was even there at his crucifixion. So that's good to know. And I think Nicodemus visiting at night is kind of an understandable thing. Nicodemus, I think, was searching for the Messiah. And there were a lot of people, the Jewish people at the time would condemn people very quickly, especially people they would perceive as, false Christs, false messiahs, would receive a lot of condemnation. The people who visit them would be ostracized, would be, they would not be treated well. So, I think, Nicodemus was, just taking actually a pretty good precaution in visiting him at night. He doesn't know that Jesus was the Christ at this point, and by visiting him at night, he can find out whether he's the Christ and not have to actually be ostracized or be put out by the Jewish people for following a false Christ, if it wasn't truly the Christ. So Nicodemus's approach is almost purely logical and not spiritual. At least that's the impression I get of him. But that doesn't mean he's any less devout. I think Nicodemus gets a bad reputation for visiting at night and for a couple of other things that happen. So his conversation with Christ I found to be really interesting. After they start talking, Christ mentions rebirth, spiritual rebirth, being born again, as it's commonly known. Let's get up here. It's a nice little structure here. Yeah. And Nicodemus says something. Now, this is one of the things that I think people will oftentimes misinterpret. Not specifically the words Nicodemus said, but what his words actually were. Nicodemus actually made a joke. And I think, that a joke is a very nuanced thing. And if you don't perceive it as a joke, which a lot of times when people say scriptures, I don't think they perceive that things could conceivably be a joke. They take every utterance as if it was, a deadly serious statement. Like the most serious soap opera utterance. And I don't think that's the case. And I think Nicodemus's line has often been misinterpreted. And he basically, I'm paraphrasing it, I'm not reading it directly, he basically says to Christ, wait, how can I be born again? How can I crawl back into my mother's stomach? That's, not possible. And I thought it was actually a pretty funny joke the first time I read it, but I know a lot of people who just interpret it as, this was really ignorant of Nicodemus. He should have known what that meant. He shouldn't have asked that question. He shouldn't have said that. But I think, more than that. This is back again, Gospel according to VG philosophy. I honestly think that what Nicodemus was doing, like I said, I think he was searching for the true Christ. But I think what he was doing was he was asking Christ questions that he already knew the answer to. And seeing how Christ would respond to these questions to test Christ, to see if he was the true Messiah. And I think that's what this question was all about. It was about him, testing, that's what the question was. Would Christ give, the correct answer to this question about being born again? Would he really know what that meant? It would be very easy for a false messiah to talk about it, but to not necessarily understand it. It's a fairly complex concept, and I think it was probably even more complex at this time. So I think it was a test of Christ, which he did very much pass with flying colors. Now, so the conversation continues. There's another part, or I think it was actually, it was a continuation of the same conversation, but Nicodemus asked a question of Christ, and Christ's answer. Now, like I said, I think a lot of people misinterpret this particular answer as well. They think that Christ is being this is a very severe reprimand from Christ. And I think if it was a reprimand, I think it'd be a very gentle, very loving reprimand. I don't think it's as severe as a lot of people seem to think it was. And this particular thing he says to Nicodemus is, you are, he repeats Nicodemus, who Nicodemus was, his standing in the Jewish community, all that stuff, and he asked him, you are all of these things, and you don't understand this concept. Now, if that was a reprimand, I think it was a very gentle reprimand of, this is something you really should know, not as a complete condemnation of him. Now, I say if it was a reprimand because, like I said, once again, I have a completely different take on this entire conversation. I don't think it was a reprimand. I think it was Christ knowing that Nicodemus was testing him to find out if he was the Christ, and he was very subtly, gently joking with Nicodemus about that and letting him know that, I know you're testing me. I know that's what you're doing. By saying, Nicodemus was asking questions he already knew the answer to, and Christ knew he was doing that, and he was letting Nicodemus know, by gently joking with him, basically. That's just my take on the conversation. I could be completely wrong. But like I said, I think Nicodemus actually does come out of this a little bit better than a lot of people seem to think he did. So anyway, that's my take on the scriptures of. We'll stand here in the light and stare off into the distance of the scriptures, John 2, 3, and 4. Great scriptures. Recommend you read them and study along. Pretty good. This upcoming Sunday, we will be studying them in church, so when I next do the video, I will bring kind of what was discussed before moving on, as I do in every one of these videos. Anyway, like and subscribe. Let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.